Okay, now I'll go back to the screen share. Okay, raise your hand if you can see the sources. You can see the sources, good. Okay, so this presentation is called From the Depths of Exclusion to the Heights of Embrace, the Book of Ruth, a lesson in paradigm shift. The reason we're dealing with the Book of Ruth this week is because this Thursday night, going on to Friday, and also for some Jews, Saturday as well, is the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, holiday of weeks of Pentecost. And we have a very, very ancient tradition among all Jewish communities, as far as I know, that among other things, we read the Book of Ruth, the scroll of Ruth, on the holiday of Shavuot. We read it in the morning, during the morning services, on the first day of the holiday, Friday morning this year. So it's appropriate now that we talk about the Book of Ruth, and I tried to find a perspective on the book that ties into the work of Roots, the Israeli-Palestinian Grassroots Initiative for Understanding Nonviolence and Transformation. I want to say before we begin that it's a short book, only 4 chapters. You could read it probably in 15 minutes, but there are many, many different interpretations, many, many different perspectives. Obviously, what we're going to do in this session of an hour and a half this time is one perspective. It's my perspective. I'm sure there can be other perspectives and perhaps even perspectives that contradict what I'm going to present here in this session. But take it for what it's worth, and I hope that you'll get something out of it. And I hope indeed we'll see the connection between the Book of Ruth and the work of Roots, the Israeli-Palestinian Grassroots Initiative for Understanding Nonviolence and Transformation. So I'm assuming that all of you read the book, but I know that some of you probably didn't. We're going to look at the source sheet to begin with, and we'll see the first section of our presentation is Introduction and General Trajectory. I'm going to read the first source here in order to put down some basic information. Beginning of the book, chapter 1, verse 1 all the way to 19. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, meaning the land of Israel, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah, with his wife and 2 sons, went to reside in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and his 2 sons were Machlon and Chilion, Ephratites of Bethlehem in Judah. By the way, Bethlehem is also called Ephrat. That's why they're called Ephratites and not Bethlehemites. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then those 2, Machlon and Chilion, also died. So the woman was left without her 2 sons, without her husband. She started out with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for in the country of Moab she had heard that the Lord had taken note of his people and given them food. In other words, back in Bethlehem, the famine is over and there's food to eat. Accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. I'm skipping a little bit. They broke into weeping, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell, but Ruth clung to her. That's after the mother-in-law, Naomi, tried to convince her daughters-in-law that they don't have to come with her back to Bethlehem. They should stay in their own country. Orpah agreed. She went back to Moab, whereas Ruth clung to Naomi. And verse 19 says the 2 went on until they reached Bethlehem. So I want to make it clear that Ruth, as she's portrayed here, when she comes to Bethlehem, she's the consummate other. Number one, she's female, and it's a patriarchal society. She's widowed. She's been married. Her husband is dead. She's very poor. She really has nothing. And she's a foreigner. So those are 4 things. She's female, widowed, poor, and a foreigner. She really is the consummate other. She's the outsider. She's going to find herself in Bethlehem with no support system, no friends, nothing, no land, no money, nothing at all. No one she can depend on. Any of you who participated in the class we gave before Passover, we talked about the concept of sojourner, the ger, the foreigner, the other. And Ruth is indeed a ger. She's going to be a ger in Bethlehem, an other, an outsider. And then on the other hand, by the end of the book of Ruth, only 4 chapters later, she's gone from A to Z. She's in a completely different situation. I'm reading now on the source sheet near the end of the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verse 11 and 13. All the people at the gate and the elders answered, "We are witnesses." And we're talking here about the wedding of Ruth. She's gotten married. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house," say the people to the husband, whose name is Boaz. "May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel, prosper in Ephrat and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem." So Boaz married Ruth, she became his wife, and he cohabited with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. So just a few minutes ago, as it were, when we began the book, she has nothing, she's an outsider, can't depend on anything, completely destitute. And now at the end of the book, she's married a man who, by the way, happens to be pretty wealthy. And she already has a child. So the truth is she's still female, but she's not widowed anymore, she's not poor. And although she's a foreigner, she's a ger, but she's been now connected into the social structure of the country to some degree. She's been embraced by the community. And that's what the book is about. It's about this trajectory. And I want to ask the question for our presentation: how and why did this amazing change come about? And what is the Torah? What is Jewish tradition trying to teach us? That's our beginning. So before we go on to the second part of the class, that was the introduction, I'm going to unmute everyone. Actually, unmute yourselves. Anyone who wants to ask something before we begin, say something is welcome. You can just unmute yourself and speak.
Rav?
Yeah.
During this period, was it not a tradition for the brother of the deceased to marry the wife and to be responsible for her?
Very, very, very good point. And that is hinted at a number of times in the book of Ruth. It turns out there are no living brothers. There were 2 sons and they're dead. There seems to have been a tradition, and part of the book that we're not really going to deal with touches on this, that if brothers do not redeem the woman by marrying her, then another relative should do that. The Torah doesn't talk about another relative doing it, but the book of Ruth seems to assume that another relative should do that, and that's actually the background to the wedding of Boaz and Ruth. He's the redeemer in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a whole aspect of the book that we're not going to talk about.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? I guess not. So we're going to go on to the second part of our presentation. You can see the source sheet. It says the radical beginning and endpoints of the trajectory. At this point, what we're going to do in the second part of the presentation is to go deeper into the beginning and endpoints and see how other Ruth was at the beginning and how redeemed and how she became so central to the Jewish people at the end. It's really a radical, radical trajectory that she undergoes. So I'm going to move the sources a little bit on the page. And I'm going to start reading from the book of Numbers, chapter 25. So this goes back to the Jewish people's time in the desert, 40 years wandering after we left Egypt. While Israel was staying at Shittim, that's a place, the people profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women, who invited the people to the sacrifices for their God. The people partook of them and worshiped that God. In other words, the Israelites were enticed to idolatry through these Moabite women who used their sexual charms, as it were, to entice the Israelites, the Jewish people, to abandon their faith. Thus Israel attached itself to Baal Peor, to the god of the Moabites, and the Lord was incensed with Israel. Skipping to verse 9, those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. In other words, there's a divine plague that comes forth upon the people for giving their allegiance to Baal Peor, to the Moabite god, and 24,000 Israelites are punished. The reason I bring this source is to show the degree of enmity that exists between the Jewish people and the Moabites. At the beginning of our history, back in the desert, we already saw the Moabites as enemies, those who are trying to entice us into idolatry and sexual licentiousness. And notice it's specifically the Moabite women that we have a grudge against. That's point number one. Now we're looking at the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23. This is also while the Jewish people, the Israelites, were in the desert for 40 years, at the end of their 40 years in the desert. No Ammonite or Moabite I made a mistake in the translation. It should be no Ammonite or Moabite shall come into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even into the 10th generation, shall never come into the congregation of the Lord. What that means is that it's forbidden for Moabites or Ammonites to become part of the Jewish people. There are three different interpretations. One is that a Jew can never marry a Moabite, and others say that includes also a Moabite can never enter into the temple in Jerusalem, and also can never enter into the legislative authority that rules the Jewish people. But it at least includes the prohibition against marriage. Jews and Moabites can't get married. Why? Verse 5 says, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt. Those are the 40 years in the desert. And the second reason, because they hired Bilam, son of Beor, from Petua, Aram, Naraim, to curse you. That's the famous Bilam, who's the soothsayer. But the Lord your God refused to heed Bilam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, for the Lord your God loves you. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. So because of these two things that happened in history, number one, the Ammonites and Moabites did not welcome the Jewish people that are wandering the desert with food and drink. And also because they tried to curse the Jewish people through Bilam. And also perhaps, of course, what it said earlier in Numbers, because of the incident with the Moabite women. For those two or three reasons, there's a command here that Jews can never, ever, 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 ever marry Moabites or Ammonites, and that you should never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. And by the way, this is talking about individuals, not just the collective. You can't marry an individual Moabite or an Ammonite. You can't concern yourself with their welfare or benefit. So again, we see that there's a long-standing feud, enmity between the Jewish people and the Moabites. And remember that this woman, Ruth, who's the center of the book of Ruth, she is a Moabite. Now I want to, I'm not going to read the next few sources, but the next few sources say is that according to some opinions, the story in the book of Ruth takes place at a time in Jewish history called the period of the Judges. And some of the rabbis trying to figure out who was the leader, who was the judge at the time that this book takes place. And one opinion is that it was the judge, the leader, whose name is Ehud. And it just so turns out from the book of Judges, we read that when Ehud was the Jewish leader, there was a long-standing war between the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, and the nation of Moab. So what I'm trying to say with that is that the background, the historical context, perhaps, to the book of Ruth, is that while this Moabite woman, Ruth, comes to Bethlehem and eventually marries Boaz, she's from the people whose women entice the Jewish people into idolatry, number one. She's number two from the people who hired Bilam to try and curse the Jewish people. Number three, she's from the people who didn't welcome the Jewish people with food and drink in the desert. Number four, there's a Torah prohibition against being concerned with their welfare and looking after their peace and ever marrying them. And now more than that, we see there's an ongoing war between the Jewish people and the Moabites at the very time that Ruth is coming to Bethlehem to search for a better life. Wow, that's a lot on our shoulder. A lot of hate, a lot of enmity, a lot of tragedy, a lot of violence. And we remember, as we said 5 minutes ago, that the story ends with Ruth getting married to a Jew by the name of Boaz and having a son. And now I want to add to that trajectory, add to what happens at the end of the book. It's not just that she marries Boaz, it's not just that she has a son, but the last 4 or 5 verses of the book of Ruth tell us the great import of her marriage to Boaz and the great import of this son who is born. So let's read now on the source sheet, Ruth chapter 4, verse 17 and henceforth. And the women neighbors gave him a name, the child, saying a son is born to Naomi. Of course, Naomi she's only the godmother. The real mother is Ruth. They named him, the women of the neighborhood named this child of Ruth, Ovad. He was the father of Jesse, father of David. That's King David. This is the line of Peretz. Peretz begat Chetzron, Chetzron begat Ram, Ram begat Aminadab, Aminadab begat Nachshon, Nachshon begat Salmon, Salmon begat Boaz, Boaz begat Ovad. Remember, Boaz is the husband of Ruth, the person that she marries in Bethlehem. Boaz begat Oved, Oved begat Yishai, Yishai begat David. That's really the whole purpose of the book, is to show how this woman Ruth went from being a Moabite, the enemy of the Jewish people, to being the mother of King David. That's something. And it's not just that she's the mother of King David. To be more exact, she's the mother of the father of King David. But King David is not just one king. He's the greatest king that the Jewish people ever had, according to Jewish law, according to Jewish mythology. He was a poet. He was a religious thinker. He was a man of great spirituality. He was a warrior. He was a wonderful king. And more than that, Jewish tradition says that he is the beginning of the line of the Messiah. He's the beginning of the line of those people who are going to redeem the world. And I brought here from the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, saying that in future times, there will be a king that will come forth from the line of Jesse, the father of David. And this person will have great wisdom and great insight, and he will do great justice. And it says he'll bring to the world a state of world peace, that the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid. Everyone's going to get along. According to many commentaries, this is a metaphor for the relationship between the different nations of the world. There'll be world peace. And it says in verse 9, the land will be filled with devotion to the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And then verses 10, 11, and 12 say that this future king is not only going to bring world peace, is also going to bring the Jewish people from the 4 corners of the universe, unite the Jewish people, bring them back to the land of Israel. In other words, there's going to be Jewish redemption, there's going to be world redemption, and it all goes back to this woman Ruth. Wow. So we see now that the book of Ruth is about how this lowly woman from a nation that is despised by the Jewish people, she becomes part of the Jewish people, and she becomes the foundation stone of the redemption of the Jewish people and of the world. So what's going on here? Why does this happen? How does this happen? And again, what does all this come to teach us? Okay, so now we finished the second part of our presentation, and I'm again going to stop for 2 minutes and say that anyone who wants to unmute themselves, please do, and ask.
Okay. Rav?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm the only one asking a question, but I have, it's pressing in my brain. So the Amorites and the Moabites are clearly the villains. how is it that Israel, who have free will, were exempted from their whorish behavior and from their allowing themselves to be influenced by these two sects? If they had free will, why are they not made to pay consequences equal to the Amorites and the Moabites? Free will is the question.
So just a little correction. It's not the Amorites and the Moabites, it's the Ammonites.
Okay, Ammonites. Okay.
That's a side point.
I'm good with that.
So, look, we read just a few minutes ago that 24,000 Israelites were punished by God for what they did. So there's definitely here a principle of responsibility. Primarily responsibility on those who did what they did, but
a slight detail I overlooked. I'm sorry. You're exactly right. You're always right.
No, I'm not. You have to take that back.
Hanan, I think that her question points to the question in history of the Jews being the chosen people and somehow having a different path towards Hashem than other people. What would you say about that?
Yeah, right. We're supposed to behave better.
Yeah.
We're supposed to resist the temptation. At a time when, according to the Torah's understanding, the whole Near East was engaging in idolatry, we're supposed to refrain from the temptation.
I have a question. When you were explaining the reason for the sort of punishment against the Moabites, it sounded similar to the punishment against the Amalekites. They treated us poorly. They didn't feed us. They attacked us when we were at our weakest point in the desert. So it seems like the act was the same, but the punishment for the Amalekites seemed more severe. And I'm curious for that distinction.
Well, I haven't given that much thought, but I'd certainly say you're right that there is a certain analogy here. These are the three nations, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Amalekites that the Torah has an axe to grind against. But I think we can say, at least on the first level, that the Amalekites get it worse because they did do something worse. What the Amalekites did is they militarily attacked the Israelites. Whereas the Moabites, it doesn't say they military attacked, it says they enticed with the, let's say, the whores, the prostitutes, or they didn't offer us food and drink, but it doesn't say they military attacked us and actually killed us. So I think it makes sense that their legacy, their punishment should be a little bit less severe.
I have a question.
Yael, Ken, yes.
Don't you have a moral problem with this Isur Goref, with this general forbidden towards the two Amim? So how come it is, we will speak about Ruth, etc., but there's a problem. Are you comfortable with it, that we're saying for so much thing about two entire people, Amim?
I think that's a very good point, but I would say that this whole presentation is meant to deal with that. But you're exactly on target. Yes, it is bothersome, and I think we'll see that that's the very point of the Book of Ruth, but I don't want to reveal too much.
I want to ask you to reveal a little bit more, Hanan. Are the Moabites the ancestors of the Palestinians?
Not that I know of. And actually, I'll add that the Talmud says that at the time of Sancheriv, this goes back 2,500 years ago, that Sancheriv bilbel et umot, which means he intermingled the peoples, so we no longer know who was a Moabite, who was an Ammonite, and for that matter, we don't know who was an Amalekite. So from the perspective of Jewish law, we don't know who these people are, so it all is null and void. All of these ideas and commandments are null and void. But I'm already saying too much. Let's leave that for the end.
I've got a question.
That's Victor.
So, so Boaz actually went against the law by marrying Ruth. That's the first one. And as was brought out by Yael, that the sons are expected to pay for the sins of their great grandfathers going back to forever. She just brought that up. Plus also he spoke about King David, this wonderful king. Isn't he also the one who had sex with a married woman and had her wife be killed? Wonderful role model there.
Yeah, he's a real human being, a real politician. So,
yeah, I have a question or comment too.
Just one
related to that.
To Victor, that's what we're going to talk about. What you brought up, I'm not going to shirk the matter. King David, we're not going to talk about, but what you talked about this marriage being actually forbidden, indeed, we'll talk about that. I promise. Yes, sorry.
I'm just wondering if the deaths of Elimelech, of Chilion and Mahlon were not, in a sense, a consequence for having left the land of Judah and gone to Moab and been part of that crew that went to Moab, and sort of in retaliation, in a sense, they remained there childless, and children did not come, in other words, until the whole system had gone back to Bethlehem, back to Judah.
You're right. That's what the tradition says. I'm going to read a source that to that effect in another few minutes. So you're also right on target. Everyone's right on target here. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go on to the third part of our presentation. I have it on the screen. Negative attitudes towards Moabites and towards interaction with them. I'm going to read from the source. It's called Midrash Ruth Rabbah. It's a rabbinic source from about a little bit less than 1,800 years ago. And it's one opinion. It's a part of tradition. It's not necessarily the only opinion. There are many, many opinions, interpretations in rabbinic thought. Here's one that I chose. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. That is from the beginning of the Book of Ruth, about these two, about the family, Naomi and Elimelech, and the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. At first, they came to them in the cities, and they found them out of control with abominations. That's enough. In other words, according to the source, the family of Naomi and Elimelech and the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they were disgusted by Moabite culture. Abominations, which in rabbinic thought probably means idolatry and sexual licentiousness. They were disgusted. And you see here the approach of the tradition to Moab. It's a disgusting culture. We don't like it. And even though the family of Elimelech and Chilion and Mahlon, as we're about to see, as Richard pointed out, are also criticized by the rabbis. But still, they found the culture to be abominable. So here's a beginning expression of the fact that because of our history with the Moabites, we have in our DNA, I'm talking about the time of this work that we're reading, the Book of Ruth, we have in us an enmity and a disgust and a reticence for the culture of Moab and the people of Moab. The next source is Midrash Ruth Rabbah, the same source, chapter 1, section 4. And this is what Richard was referring to, partly. Elimelech was one of the great leaders of his district. Elimelech, again, is the husband of Naomi and one of the financial supporters of his generation. But when the years of famine came, remember there was famine in Bethlehem, that's why the family left. He said, now all Israel will come knocking at my door, each one with his basket. Each one's going to come with his begging cup, asking for a handout. And I don't want to give them money. He got up and fled from them. This is the meaning of the verse, and the man went out from Bethlehem in Judah. In other words, the tradition criticizes him. He's a rich guy. He should have stayed in Bethlehem at the time of famine and supported his people. Instead, he left because he didn't want to give out any of his financial resources. That's important for us because it leads us to the next source. Midrash Yelkut Shimoni on the Book of Ruth. This is another rabbinic source, rabbinic midrash. And they took for themselves Moabite women. That's a verse from the Book of Ruth that we just read a few minutes ago, that these two young men married Moabite women. What caused them to take Moabite women was because they behaved like Ammon and Moab in their stinginess. They did not meet you with food and water. It was just like our tradition tells us that back in the desert, the Moabites did not meet the Israelites with food and water. They withheld from us those things. So the same thing with Machlon and Kilion, like their father, they were stingy. And instead of staying in the land of Israel in Bethlehem at the time of famine and helping the people with their resources, they left. They left. And what we're hearing here in a hint is that the rabbis understand, as Richard said, that they were punished. They were punished for their stinginess by their deaths. And of course, I just want to add that you see how the Midrash talks about Ammon and Moab as being stingy. In other words, we have in our tradition this enmity, this prejudice, these stereotypes against the Moabite people. I want to tell you a little story. My partner in Shorashim, in Roots, Khaled Abu Awad, the co-director of our organization, is a very, very honest and open person. And one of the things we do in Roots is we criticize our own people. The Palestinians talk about what's wrong with their culture that causes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to continue. And the Jews look into their own culture, what in our culture is causing this conflict to continue. And one of the stories that Khaled often tells about the prejudices that Palestinians have against Jews is, he says, you can often hear Palestinian mothers, when their kids are fighting, tell the kids, don't fight like Jews. Don't be violent with your friends like the Jews are. And here you see that type of prejudice going back, way back when in the Jewish sources. When someone was stingy, we say that he's like Ammon and Moab. Okay. Let's look at another source. A Midrash Ruth Rabban, rabbinic source, as we said, with the interpretation of the Book of Ruth. They married Moabite women. These two young men, Machlon and Kilion, married Moabite women. The Tanaim, that means the early rabbis, taught in the name of Rabbi Meir that they did not convert them, nor did they immerse them, in other words, in the mikveh for conversion. And the new halacha had not been made, and they were punished on account of them. The halacha being Ammonite and not Ammonitis, Moabite and not Moabitis. There's a hint here to something that we're going to talk about another half an hour. It's not our subject now. That at a certain point, the law was changed. And at a certain point, they said you're allowed to marry Moabite women. But this source that we're reading right now is saying that law had not been changed yet when these two young men, Kilion and Machlon, married these two girls, Orpah and Ruth, and they were punished for marrying them. As I said earlier, they were punished by their death. So keep in mind that we learned something here, or we have a hint here to some type of change of the law, that you're allowed later, not now, later to marry a Moabite woman. And we'll see what happens with that as we go on. At this point, we're reading that they did what they weren't supposed to do, and they got zapped. They got totally zapped. Another source, the one at the bottom of the page. And this is a verse from the Book of Ruth. Bring it to the top of the page. Verse 13, should you wait for them to grow up? This is when Naomi, the widow, is telling her two daughter-in-laws, I'm going back to the land of Judah, the land of Bethlehem. Don't come with me, because you'll never get married if you come back with me. Should you wait for them to grow up? In other words, if I have a son you won't be able to marry him because it'll be too long. It'll take another 20 years at least. Should you, on their account, debar yourselves from marriage just because you're going to wait for my sons? You won't be married for 20 years. That doesn't make sense. Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me. So she complains that God zapped her. Her husband died, her 2 sons died. The reason I'm bringing this verse is because the Hebrew is not clear. The translation that I brought here says, my lot is far more bitter than yours, says the mother to the 2 daughters-in-law. The Hebrew is marli mikem, which literally means I am embittered because of you. I'm embittered because of you. And why am I bringing this? Because it could very well be that although Naomi loves and cherishes her 2 daughter-in-laws, still they represent for her, the 2 Moabite women represent for Naomi her sins, her mistakes, the fact that her sons married Moabite women and look what happened. And they symbolize her bitterness, her suffering, her pain. It's because of these girls that her 2 sons died. So she harbors in her heart a sense perhaps that I don't really want you to come back with me to Bethlehem because you represent all the evil in my past. If you come back with me to Bethlehem, the people are going to look at you and say, that's the evil that they did. They married Moabite women. Now Naomi's walking around and parading in front of us. No, I'm embittered because of you. And again, why do I bring this? To show the degree of enmity, of prejudice, of ill will against the Moabites. And it may even be that Naomi herself bears this in her heart towards her daughter-in-laws. I think it makes a lot of sense. Another verse, Ruth chapter 2, verse 9. And Naomi answered her daughter-in-law Ruth. This is after they come into Bethlehem. Mm-hmm. And we find that Ruth is leaving the house. As we'll see later, she's gleaning in the fields, trying to make a living for the family. And Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, it is best, daughter, that you go out with his girls, such that you will not be molested in some other field. I read this to show that Naomi has a fear that her daughter-in-law, the Moabite woman, is going to be molested. Why? Because the Jews don't like them. The Jews have a lot of enmity towards them. Uh-oh. Jews have a grudge against them. It's dangerous to be a Moabite and walk about in the streets of Bethlehem. Be careful. In another few minutes, we'll end this 3rd part of our lesson and we'll open it up for questions. I'll just read another few verses. Ruth chapter 2, verse 10. She prostrated herself with her face to the ground and said to him, why are you so kind as to single me out when I'm a foreigner? This is something that Ruth says to Boaz when she first meets him, and he acts nicely towards her. And she asks, why are you being nice to me? I'm a foreigner. Though that she doesn't expect to be behaved nicely towards, because she knows that the Jews don't like Moabites, and perhaps because many other people are molesting her and bothering her. Suddenly this guy Boaz is acting nicely. She says, why acting nicely towards me? I don't get it. And again, I bring this just in order to emphasize the point of the enmity and the ill will that the men and women of Judah harbor towards the Moabites. Here's another verse, chapter 4 of the book, near the end of the book of Ruth. The Redeemer replied, this is someone who is apparently eligible to marry Ruth, but decides not to. I won't go into the whole story. The Redeemer replied, then I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I destroy my own inheritance. He's explaining why he can't marry Ruth. And the question is, what does it mean, lest I destroy my own inheritance? And it may mean, according to many commentators, it means if I were to marry this Moabite woman, what would people say about me? My whole reputation would be down the drain. I'd be sinning terribly. It's something I can't do. It's a taboo that I cannot transgress. That might be the meaning of lest I destroy my own inheritance. And again, I bring that just in order to emphasize again and again and again the degree of separation, of enmity that exists here between the Israelites or the Judahites or the Jews and the Moabites. And the last source I'm going to bring in this third part of our presentation is a few generations later. It's King David. Remember, Ruth gave birth to Ovad, who gave birth to Jesse, who gave birth to King David. So it's 4 generations later. And we have King David thinking about the fact that people are still gossiping behind his back, that he comes from a line of a Moabite woman. Midrash Ruth Rabbah, chapter 8, section 1. Rabbi Abba said, son of Kahana, began, so tremble and sin no more. Ponder it on your bed inside. It's a verse from Psalms. We don't have to understand it. But on that verse, there is an explication of the Midrash. It says, David said before the Holy One, blessed be he, David prayed to God, until when are they going to cause me to tremble? Now, I left out a word. Until when are they going to stop causing me to tremble and say, isn't his family illegitimate? And isn't he from Ruth the Moabitess? So I'm just trying to show that this enmity and this suspicion and this taboo against the Moabites continues even many generations later, at least according to the way the Midrash understands it. So that's the end of part 3. Let's again stop for a minute or two and see if anyone wants to comment.
So I have a question about one of the sources.
Who's
So this is Andrew.
Yes, hello, Andrew.
Hi. So the Midrash Ruth Rabbah, chapter 2, section 9, the commentary on Ruth 1:4, it says the Tanaim taught in the name of Rabbi Meir that they did not convert them, nor did they immerse them. I'm just curious what immersion means there.
That's immersion in a pool of water as part of the framework, the process of conversion. I'll just add at this point, since you brought up that as far as we can see, at the time that this book of Ruth is taking place, there really is no such thing as a formal conversion process in the Jewish people. There's just a gradual people entering Jewish society. But the Midrash anachronistically assumes that there is a conversion process, but these 2 young men didn't have their Moabite wives converted. They just broke the law, number 1, by not converting them, and number 2, by the fact that they were Moabite women. That's part of the criticism that the Midrash has of these 2 young men.
Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to go on now to part 4 of our presentation. I call this Ruth confounds stereotypes through her loving kindness towards her mother-in-law. So remember, the Moabites are not supposed to be good people. They're not hospitable. They don't welcome you with food and drink. But despite that taboo, despite that stereotype, that prejudice, we find in the book of Ruth the following, chapter 1, verse 16. But Ruth replied, she's talking to Naomi, who's trying to convince her not to come back to Bethlehem with her, but to stay in her homeland of Moab. But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. So Ruth, she knows if she stays in Moab, she could get married again. She'll be with her people and a culture she knows. But nevertheless, she sees her bitter, widowed mother-in-law going back home to Bethlehem with nothing. And she says, Ruth says, I'm going to come with you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to support you. I'm going to be with you till death do we part. And it's irrational. Ruth is going to get nothing out of it. She's going to a country where they won't like her. There are stereotypes and prejudices against her. She'll have no support system, no money, no friends, nothing to eat. But simply because of her loving kindness, her concern, in Hebrew we call it chesed, for her mother-in-law, she's willing to literally sacrifice her whole life for this woman, Naomi. That's extremely, extremely important. And then in chapter 2 of this book, Ruth chapter 2, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, I would like to go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain behind someone who may show me kindness. Yes, daughter, go, she replied. And off she went. She came and gleaned in a field. What we have here is they come back, the two women, to Bethlehem. Naomi, who left there many, many years ago, and Ruth, who's never been there before. And Naomi is so bitter, she doesn't even go out to try and make a living. She stays at home. And Ruth volunteers to go into the fields and glean. To glean means to walk after the harvesters and pick up what's left. And the Torah says, Jewish law says, that the harvesters are supposed to only go to the field once, not go through a second and third time, and whatever they leave behind the first time is for the poor to glean, to pick up, to collect. And Ruth goes out, she volunteers to support her mother-in-law. She doesn't tell her, how does mother-in-law come with me? Her mother-in-law is the Jew, the mother-in-law who will feel comfortable in the society. Ruth is the one who's a stranger. She's going to be molested, she's going to be attacked, she's going to be spit upon, but she takes upon herself to support her mother-in-law. That's a second example of her great loving kindness for her mother-in-law. And we remember that the Torah had said that the Moabites didn't provide food for the Israelites in the desert. But here, Ruth behaves exactly the opposite. She provides food for her Israelite, for her Jewish mother-in-law. She is confounding the stereotype with her great concern, her loving kindness, her chesed, her support of her mother-in-law. Here's one more verse we're going to read, Ruth chapter 2. So she stayed close to the maidservants of Boaz. In other words, she's gleaning in the fields behind the servants of Boaz. It's in his field, and gleaned until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest was finished. That's at least 10 weeks. And she dwelt with her mother-in-law. So she's supporting the family for at least 10, 11 weeks. All she does is glean in the field from morning until evening. She's working hard to support her mother-in-law. And again, what we see in this is that Ruth confounds the stereotypes. She behaves in a fashion that the Torah doesn't predict. The Torah wouldn't expect. She's not acting like a Moabite. She's different. She's something else. And that's going to have profound effect. Okay, so we now finished part 4 of our presentation. Let's see if anyone wants to stop us for a minute. Okay, so I guess there's no one. We're going to go on. Part 5 of this presentation, it's now on the screen. Boaz overcomes stereotypes and prejudice and shows loving kindness towards Ruth, the Moabite. So we see here a kind of reciprocal motion, just like Ruth confounds stereotypes and acts in a fashion you wouldn't expect with her loving kindness towards her mother-in-law. So on the other hand, Boaz overcomes the stereotypes of how an Israelite, how a Jew is supposed to feel and think and act towards Moabites, and he acts and he feels and he thinks differently. He overcomes the prejudice and the taboos and the stereotypes that begin with the Torah, as we read, and continue throughout the generations until his time. So Ruth chapter 2, the verses say, presently Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. He greeted the reapers. He's a rich man. He has a lot of reapers. He says, the Lord be with you. And they responded, the Lord bless you. Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose girl is this? He sees Ruth gleaning in the fields. Who's that woman? I never saw her before. The servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is a Moabite girl who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, no, the servant says that Ruth said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. She has been on our feet ever since she came this morning. She has rested but little in the hut. Boaz said to Ruth, he approaches this Moabite girl, this despised, lowly girl from this terrible nation. Listen to me, daughter. Don't go to glean another field. Don't go elsewhere, but stay here close to my girls. He's inviting her to get as much food as she needs. Keep your eyes on the field they are reaping and follow them. I have ordered the men not to molest you. In other words, perhaps in other fields they'll bother you. In my field they won't bother you. You're safe here. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink some of the water that the men have drawn. He doesn't have to offer her to drink, but he does. She prostrated herself with her face to the ground and said to him, why are you so kind as to single me out when I'm a foreigner? We saw that verse earlier. Boaz said in reply, I have been told of all you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in the land of your birth and came to a people you had not known before. May the Lord reward your deeds. May you have full recompense from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge. So he shows great concern for this nothing girl. Great concern. She answered, you are most kind, my lord, to comfort me and to speak gently to your maidservant, though I am not so much as one of your maidservants. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here and partake of the meal and dip your morsel in the vinegar. He invites her to have lunch with him. This great man invites this lowly Moabite girl, so despised, to have lunch with him and his workers. So she sat down beside the reapers. He handed her roasted grain and she ate her fill and had some left over. When she got up again to glean, Boaz gave orders to his workers, you are not only to let her glean among the sheaves without interference, but you must also pull some stalks out of the heaps and leave them for her to glean and not scold. In other words, he's doing a trick here. He's telling his field workers to purposely leave some sheaves on the field, on the ground, so she can pick them up. To make a long story short, he completely overcomes and undoes the prejudices and the taboos that he's been trained on, that come from the Torah, that come from the history he's living, that his people are at war with the Moabites, and he sees in front of him a human being, an individual. He doesn't stereotype her, he doesn't label her as a Moabite. She's a poor young girl in need. He's heard great things about the way she's behaved towards her mother-in-law, and he gives her respect, and more than respect, he actually gives her food and drink. Here, chapter 2, Ruth the Moabite said, he even told me, she's telling Naomi what Boaz said to her, stay close by my workers until all my harvest is finished. He gives her an open ticket to glean in his field until the end of the harvest. Next verse from chapter 3. This is something he says to her in chapter 3. And now, my daughter, have no fear. I will do on your behalf whatever you ask, for all the elders of my town know what a fine woman you are. By the way, I'm not so sure that all the elders of Bethlehem know what a fine woman she is. No, she's a Moabite. She caused the death of Machlon el Chilyon, but he tells her that everyone thinks you're a great woman. He builds her up, he compliments her. Or perhaps you can't imagine the prejudice of his fellow countrymen. However you read it, he's certainly someone who's overcome his prejudice and doing great favors for this poor Moabite girl. And lastly, in the section of our class, I bring the verse from Leviticus chapter 19 that some of you studied with me a month ago, actually almost 2 months ago before Passover. We studied the commandments of proper behavior towards strangers and sojourners, the ger. Just to remind you, when a sojourner sojourns with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. The sojourner who sojourns with you shall be as a native from among you. You shall love him as yourself. For you were sojourners in the land of Egypt, I am Lord your God. It may be the Torah has a contradiction in a certain sense. It says, love the sojourner, but don't love the Moabite. And here we have Boaz, who ignores, as it were, the Torah's prohibition against being beneficial to the Moabites, and all he takes into account is the general idea of loving the other, loving the stranger, looking out for those who are less fortunate than you. So again, he's putting aside the enmity against the Moabites and confounding the stereotypes and the taboos. So now we have 15 minutes left, which is just enough to finally get to the point. The last part of this class is part 6, the Archimedean point. So, okay, what happens? Why does everything change? How do we overcome finally the taboos against Moabites such that Boaz marries her and she becomes the mother of redemption? How does it happen? What's going on here? Let's skip the first source and read the second one. Actually, we're not even going to read the second source. I decided that time is short. What you can read between the lines of the second source is that when Boaz invited Ruth to sit with him, and he gave her of his food and drink and acted respectfully towards her, that's the beginning of redemption. That's the beginning of the wheels that turn, that ultimately bring about the birth of King David, the birth of the Messiah, the tikun olam, the fixing of the world. It all begins with the act of chesed, with the act of loving kindness, the act of overcoming taboos and enmity of the past, the act of not behaving according to the stereotypes and generalizations, but looking at the individual in front of you. The change begins the minute that he gives her of his food. That's the beginning of redemption. And now we'll read the next source, which is Midrash Ruth Rabbah, chapter 7, verse 7. It says, meanwhile, Boaz had gone to the gate and sat down there. And now the Redeemer whom Boaz had mentioned passed by, the person who perhaps could marry Ruth because he's not a, he's in line to marry. I won't go into all the background. He called. In other words, Boaz said to the guy, come over and sit down here, so-and-so. And he came over and sat down. On that, Rabbi Samuel, the son of Nachman, said that he, meaning that man that Boaz called over, was ignorant of the words of the Torah. He said, the first ones did not die except because they married her. And I'm going to go and marry her? In other words, we know the Torah says you can't marry a Moabite woman. And we know that Machlon and Kilyon, at least one of them, was married to her and was punished by God. What are you asking me to marry her? I'm not going to do it. We hate those people. They're terrible. They're death and destruction for us. They're our enemies. I will not pollute my seed. I'm not going to create unfitness for my children. And he did not know that the halacha had been changed. Ammonite and not Ammonitis, Moabite and not Moabitis. So the Midrash is claiming that everything that this person thought, that you're not allowed to marry Moabites, yes, it's true, but it was true only until yesterday. Today it's changed. He hadn't heard that there's a new halakha. The new halakha says, there's a new law that says that that Jews are allowed to marry female Moabites, they're just not allowed to marry males. There's a whole prohibition in the Torah is not going to be reinterpreted. The prohibition that says you can't get involved with the Moabites, you can't get involved in the Moabites, it only means the men. You can't get involved with the men, but you're allowed to get involved with the women. Whereas if there's men, you're not allowed to be nice to them, not allowed to show them benefit. Jewish women can't marry them, but if it's a Moabite woman, you're allowed to be nice to them, you're allowed to accept them, you're allowed to marry them. And this person who doesn't want to marry Ruth, he didn't know that the law has been changed. Now we have to ask ourselves, what do you mean? When was the law changed? What are you talking about? What's going on here? Who changed the law? We're about to get to that right now. So here I brought for you in the next two sources, the new law. And the new law says an Ammonite and a Moabite are forbidden to come into the congregation of the Lord, and their prohibition is forever. However, their women are permitted. It's only against the men, not the women. And then the Babylonian Talmud in tractate, I forgot to put what tractate it is. It's in Yevamot. Let me write that in there. And explains, how did the rabbis come to this conclusion that you're allowed to marry the women, it's just the men not? Because the Torah is written in the male. It says, don't allow a Moabite into the congregation. It doesn't say a Moabitess. So the rabbi said it doesn't apply to women. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, because when the Torah speaks in the masculine, it means the feminine as well. And in no other place do we find the rabbi saying that this prohibition or this law or this custom applies because it's only in the masculine, it doesn't apply to the feminine. This is completely sui generis. The rabbis here, or someone who's creating a new interpretation, why are they creating a new interpretation? Why are they allowing female Moabites to enter into the Jewish people? What's happening here? And here comes the answer. Here comes the answer. Babylonian Talmud tractate Tubot, page 7b. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, this is Boaz, and he said, sit you here, and they sat. He puts together a minyan, a quorum of 10 men. And what does Rabbi Abau derive from this verse? One of the rabbis in the Talmud, he derives that the Torah prohibition with regard to marrying members of the nations of Ammon and Moab is limited to a male Ammonite and not a female Ammonite, and to a male Moabite and not a female Moabite. I'll explain, but I first want to go on. If it would enter your mind that he gathered the men, in other words, Boaz gathered the 10 men in order to derive a halakha, to derive a new law, would it not have been sufficient if there were not 10? You don't need 10, you only need 2. You only need 1. The Gemara answers, the rabbis say, yes, in fact, a quorum of 10 is not necessary to issue a halachic ruling. Nevertheless, Boaz convened 10 elders to publicize the matter. As Shmuel said to Rav Chana of Baghdad, go and bring me an assembly of 10 men. I'll say to you before them a halakha that I seek to disseminate. That's an example. You need 10 men to make it known. So what did we just read? We just read that the law that says you cannot be nice to an Ammonite and a Moabite, you can't give them food and water, you can't seek their peace and benefit them, you can't marry them. That law was changed to apply to the men, but not to the women. When? At the very moment that we're reading. It was changed in the Book of Ruth, at the end of the Book of Ruth, by Boaz. He collected a group of men and said, we're changing the law right now. When is it happening? At the very moment that he wants to marry Ruth. He changed the law right now. And why did he change the law? Because Ruth doesn't behave like a Moabitess. She behaves differently. She broke the stereotype. She showed that the taboos of the past are not fully applicable. She showed that stereotypes aren't completely true. She showed that at least there is one Moabitess who's not like you thought, who's different. And this man, Boaz, with great loving kindness, opened himself up to her and listened to her and fed her and protected her. He saw a human being. And his understanding of her as a human being, as a wonderful, loving, kind human being who does so much good for her mother-in-law. He saw here a human being and he said, it can't be that the law applies to her. It's impossible. We must have misunderstood the law. We have to find a way in the law such that this taboo, this stereotype doesn't apply. We've learned that the stereotype is not applicable. We've learned that times have changed. We learned there's been a mistake. We have to go back and mine the Torah, search in the Torah a way to reinterpret it because it just can't be. And at the very minute that he gets these 10 men together, he says, we're changing the law. and they find a loophole. They find a way in the Torah to pin it on the verse. They say, the verse is in the masculine, so it doesn't apply to the feminine. And they change the law. And he marries her. And he brings her into the Jewish people. But more than that, a number of things happen. He tells us, he shows us, the whole book of Ruth shows us and tells us that the taboos of the past can and should be undone. We learn that generalities don't always apply. We learn that you have to look beyond the generalities. You have to go beyond the enmity. You have to even go beyond the fact that Ammonites and the Judites are at war at this point. You see a human being in front of you, and you understand that it can't be, it just can't be, that the Torah wants us to behave badly towards them. It just can't be, says Boaz to himself. And you have all these rabbinic sources that are telling us this. They're giving a stamp of approval to this great Jew who was able to see that the stereotypes don't apply, and he took upon himself to change the law. He in a certain sense, redeemed the Torah. He found new meaning in the Torah to allow for the expression of brotherhood and sisterhood and marriage and connectivity and seeking of peace and common welfare between Jews and Moabites because of his experience with this one woman. He had a mind that was able to go beyond prejudice, and he found a woman who didn't meet the prejudices and the stereotypes, and that changed history. According to the rabbinic sources, that changed history. It allowed this woman to enter the Jewish people. It allowed King David to be born. It allowed the Messiah of the future to be born. And it changed the world. Tikun olam, improving the world. So I didn't have time to look at all the sources, but they all emphasize this point that we just talked about. So ultimately, you're all obviously going to ask, okay, so what's the message? What does this teach us? So I'll tell you what I think, just what I think. I'm just one person. It looks like, according to at least part of Jewish tradition, it's a good thing to try and break down taboos. It's a good thing to try and overcome stereotypes, even if they're stereotypes that are rooted in the tradition, in the Torah. It's a good thing to look at a human being as an individual and not just part of a collective that you hate. And when you see that individual, and you see a human being, you may begin to understand that everything you thought about his or her people may not be completely true. And perhaps I should re-examine my generalities and my understandings and my prejudices. Now, I'm not recommending that we just go and change everything in the Torah, but I am showing that the Torah, according to Jewish tradition, wants itself to develop. It wants itself to have new insight found within it. It wants us to interpret it to go beyond prejudice and stereotype and generalization. It wants us to find room for more and more human beings to be seen as human beings. And that process, says the source we saw, is the process of redemption. That's the process of redemption. Overcoming stereotypes, even stereotypes that are written black and white in the verses of the Torah. There's a way to get over them. There's a way to overcome them. So what does that mean about Israelis and Palestinians? Well, I can't be certain. Of course I can't be certain. I don't learn from this that every Jew should go out and marry Palestinians like Boaz married Ruth. But I do learn from this, at least, that when you have Palestinians who behave like Ruth, who exhibit qualities of humanity, of loving kindness, that you see that in them, that you appreciate it, and that it help you to rethink your prejudices against Palestinians. Even if we have a long, long history of enmity, even if presently we're at war with them. But look at a human being, look at the individual, see the goodness there, and use that to rethink what you read in the news, and what you read in the Jewish sources, and everything that people are telling you the bad things about them. And perhaps even you'll come to the conclusion you should be friends. You should seek their welfare, seek their good, provide them with food and drink. Perhaps, certainly. So as you saw, I called this presentation From the Depths of Exclusion to the Heights of Embrace, the Book of Ruth, a lesson in paradigm shift. And I really see here an opening. The Book of Ruth is telling us to be open, to going beyond prejudices and taboos and enmities of the past and of the present. It's 9:30. I did manage to stay within the time of an hour and a half. Certainly for those who want to stay, we'll have questions and answers. I did want to allow Zach Schaefer, who's the president of the American Friends of Roots, to say a few words about Roots and about the Friends of Roots.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rav Hanan, for that beautiful teaching and lesson. I am proudly sitting here in my Roots t-shirt, looking forward to many more of these, as we have many planned on upcoming Sundays. So I hope to see many more of you on those. And I think I was particularly very excited for this lesson because I think the story of Ruth really embodies so much of that work that we are doing on the ground in the region, which is to try to overcome those abstractions, those caricatures, those stereotypes, and to really see the humanity in the individual, to see the individual in the individual. And Roots is, fortunately, even in the midst of this coronavirus crisis, when this work is more important than ever, we are on the ground doing that work every single day, bringing people together right now, particularly on Zoom, on webinars for interfaith conversations, bringing youth together to come together and meet the other, bringing Israeli and Palestinian women digitally into one another's homes to learn about their villages, to see their families, to share recipes and food and menus that are traditional to their cultures, and to start to unwrap and unravel those relationships that we can have. And I want to just take this moment in this call to thank all of you for being a part of this work and for joining this call, and to let all of you know that this work is happening. It is more important than ever. And all of us, by being here, get to be a part of this really messianic work of pursuing the humanity of the other and working across these divides and modeling what we learn in the development of the Torah and in Ruth. So I really want to offer to everyone here an opportunity to be a part of this work, to follow up with Hanan or myself. If you go to friendsofroots.net/donate, you're able to make a contribution online. And if you're interested in giving your time, your skills, your passion, your networks, hosting for a community or institution or anything else, you can reach out to Hanan or myself directly, and we would love to work with you. But we're all in this together, and for all of you to be on this call and to join us allows you to really not talk about the work as a third person, not talk about the work that they're doing over there, but to talk about the work that we are doing. All of us on this call can be a part of that we, and I want to encourage you to join that. And I see I already got one private message asking to contact someone who's interested, which is wonderful. And with that, I'm going to leave it to Hanan and to all of you for the Q&A. And I want to thank you all again for being a part of this and encourage you to make a donation and to reach out.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you very much. So anyone who wants to comment or ask or object is welcome. I say Yael is nodding.
Can I?
Yes.
I'm a little bit upset. I'm sorry. I'm upset of the few things of, you know, why women and not men, you know. Okay, first. Second, What do you think about this solution of the Bible and the Jewish tradition? Third, how do you explain or how do you understand the silence in the Bible around the choice of Boaz? How come that Boaz is saying nothing about his choice, have chosen a Moabite girl? And how come we read nothing around him in the Bible, in the Sefer Ruth about this choice? You know, if it's so, in the Isur kol kach chamur, if it's so prohibited, how come there no, you know, it's a catastrophe? And just to be also positive, I like very much the lesson of learning and changing stereotype. But you know, like HaChomer is a little bit too much narrow-minded in the Bible, so I'm questioning.
Yeah, I understand, I think. I'm trying to remember everything you said. So, excuse me, just say the first words you said again so I could just remember. The first thing you brought up was, yeah.
Why women and not men, you know?
So the sources that we saw in the Book of Ruth are referring to this particular case of a woman, of Ruth. And a way is found, a way of exegesis, of interpretation, of parshanut is found to allow her to overcome the stereotype. I see that as part of a general direction, a megama, of overcoming the stereotype completely. And that's what happens indeed when the Talmudic rabbis say that Sancheriv, the Assyrian general, going back 2,500 years ago, completely mixed up the nations so that we don't know today who is a Moabite and who is an Ammonite. Now, why did the rabbis say that he mixed up the nations? It's true that he did. That was his policy. But why did they make a point of it? Because they want to find a way to overcome the pointing out of particular characteristics of nations. It's part of a process of universalization. To me, that's important. You also asked about Boaz. So look, what we saw today in this lesson, according to the rabbinic sources, Boaz is a halachic innovator. He seizes the moment when he understands that the way things were understood in the past can't be any more. And halachic literature puts him on a pedestal. He's understood to be a great sage for what he did. To me, that's also a wonderful lesson. But in a certain sense, you can say Boaz was a stereotype breaker. And not only did he do so as a social activist, he did it as a halachic scholar. To me, that's a very fine example of what we need today. Did I miss anything?
How do you understand the fact that there is no reaction inside the Bible of his chidush? Nor either Boaz is not saying I'm making a revolutionary new, other a kehila misaviv.
I see. So that's actually a very broad and deep question. We really didn't study today the Book of Ruth as a discrete unit. We studied the Book of Ruth in the context of Jewish tradition. The sources we read made a lot of assumptions that historically may not be true, may not be proven. That's what I said at the very, very beginning, that there are different interpretations, there are different assumptions. It could be that in the time of, I don't know what the assumptions were, but as a Jewish scholar, I look at the Book of Ruth in the context of the Torah, in the context of the Book of Judges, in the context of the Book of Isaiah. When I read it as a unit, we come to what we came to. But the Book of Ruth on its own perhaps is something else. I don't know. Okay, anyone else? I'm sure there's someone else who wants to say something. I guess I'm wrong. Okay, so I was wrong. No one else wants to say anything.
This is Victor.
Victor, yes.
I'm wondering, you got me wondering, it's that easy for one person to just go ahead and change the law?
No, it's not.
It sounds like in this country with the executive privilege of the president.
No, of course you're right that it's not that easy. I would think that everything we saw today wants us to assume that Boaz was a great, great, great scholar. He had a lot of influence and prestige, and people accepted him and relied upon him. Again, those are historical constructs that the sources want us to assume. I really can't say more than that, but you're right. In general, the halachic process isn't so simple or so quick. But again, for me, it is a model. It's a paradigm that that the tradition, perhaps, at least part of the tradition, wants more scholars who are willing to break down stereotypes and see human beings. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
I'm just looking 5 more seconds. Anyone else want to speak? Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. The publicity about our coming events will come out today or tomorrow. The next event is on Monday, June 1st at 8 p.m. And I'll be here hosting 2 leaders of the Land for All movement, which is a political movement in Israel of Israelis and Palestinians that advocates a political plan that many of us in Roots thinks gives expression to many of the social and religious principles that we teach. So the Land for All movement has found a way to translate them into political terms. We'll be hosting here Meron Rappaport, an Israeli journalist, and Thabit Abu Ras, a Palestinian intellectual. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing.
Thanks.
Anan, can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you feel about the stereotype? You know, the huge place of the Sefer Ruth. How are you comfortable ethically of being להישען על ספר שיש בו סטריאוטיפים, even though it's changing? How are you with it?
You can ask me not only how comfortable I am with the Book of Ruth, how comfortable I am with all of Jewish tradition.
Yeah, okay, I am.
Look, Jewish tradition has lots of things I don't like, but it has more things that I do like. And for me, this is a long discussion, just a few sentences. Jewish tradition, just as much as it is a set of givens, it is a framework for change and progress and advancement. For me, it is a set of signposts that tells direction that we would like human society to move in. And I follow those signposts as best as I can.
So you are looking the signposts that are inspiring, and those ones who you feel that are not inspiring, you are putting them aside. This is what you are doing?
No, I personally have accepted the whole package of Jewish tradition. So I do what Jewish tradition tells me. Sometimes I chafe against it. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. But again, it's not just what it says to do, it's also the signposts that say what direction we should be walking in. And I hope that my reading of the signs is loyal to what the tradition wants. And I hope and believe that Roots, Shorshim Judur, is reading those signposts well and pushing us, nudging us in the right direction.
Thank you.
Hanan,
Yeah.
you keep mentioning Jewish tradition as if there is one.
Good point.
Right now, the Zionists tell us that is Jewish tradition. That's, you know, I don't see that there is one tradition. It seems to me that, quote, Jews pick up the traditions that they want and discard the others. I believe, I like what I've heard of the teachings of Rabbi Hillel, and I know he would not be wanting to be considered a Zionist. So when you say Jewish tradition, please say your interpretation, please expound upon that. Just like saying Jewish or Moabite. And that's why I usually put Jewish in quotes.
Well, look, I think you're right. I think that Jewish tradition is very, very, very broad and wide and deep. There's a lot of different contradictory tendencies and tides and currents there. And certainly my teachings are one take on Jewish tradition, and there's going to be other different, sometimes complementary, sometimes contradictory takes on Jewish tradition. In the end, we all choose which Jewish tradition we want to be our Jewish tradition, I think.
Thank you.
Right. And then we try and convince everyone else that our reading is the only reading.
Right.
So I'll tell you that I don't try to convince anyone that my reading is the only reading.
Right. Actually, that's why I have found recently, I'm going to recommend, and I think I did one time, a Taoist who mentions that it's even in Taoism, there's the philosophy, and some people have gone ahead and made a religion out of it. Well, I've been following recently his philosophy aspect of it, and I find it amazing. His name is Derek Lin, and you can look up, I'll spell it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat. It's not letting me write. It's not letting me write. Anyway, it's Derek Lin, DerekLin, or look up Taoism, TAOISM.net. And in particular, when I read his translation of the first chapter, to me, it said, aha, that is what has been taken and changed, corrupted into what is called God. And I generally, in fact, Sunday mornings, which was going to overlap with your Sunday mornings for about half an hour, he has his discussions going in depth of different chapters of the Tao. And for me, I find that amazing. To me, it's I could see where Rabbi Hillel would have said, yes, that is Judaism without the divinity. Take away the God and you have that. So I would highly recommend looking into that. I have all his books, and as I said, and it goes in without the historic settings which should be changed. And in his discussions, he discusses the differences of the language between then and now. And of course, there's no divinity.
Okay, so I guess that's a good way to end.
Thank you.
Opening us up to other understandings and traditions. Anyone else want to comment at the end?
I just want to thank you because I come from a very different perspective. What one might call a Christian reading of the Hebrew scriptures. And I recognize there's a certain inauthenticity in that. And so it's very good to get an internal reading, one might call it, rather than the sort of secondhand external reading, which brings life that otherwise is not always there. So I want to thank you, Rav. I want to thank you very much.
And I would like to tell you that I like very much the fact that you take the Book of Ruth in order to make some peace message and some hope message, and to try to lirkom inside the tradition and not breaking the tradition. So thank you for this. It's a kind of chalaklak. Thank you.
That's my method. I think there's someone who wants to speak, but I'm not sure. My screen only says iPhone. Yeah, but you're muted. I'm trying to unmute you. Yeah, now you're good.
All right, my family would say, what a gift, unmute. But I want to just say to you, appreciate, back in Ruth chapter 2, when you were talking about how there was an opposite with the Moabites and how Ruth responded, and then of course Boaz responded. There was an opposite. This is what I'm going to really focus on, because Naomi received the opposite. You mentioned about how her husband had been so stingy. Excuse me. And in that, there's a stereotype. There's like two men. There's a comparison of the two men. They're the Jewish men, but Boaz is also the opposite, and what that brings forth. So I'm going to build that out more, but you just gave me that nugget, and there's something huge for me in that, in the end of your narrative, because it's like, it's not about systematic theology, creating it so it'll work your narrative. There's something in that that's powerful. So thank you for that. And I'm going to sit on it. And sorry, I can't articulate right now, but I was like, that's a huge part. That's like a germination.
And thank you. That's Elimelech and Boaz. Indeed, they're two opposites.
Yep.
Okay. Very, very good. So thank you everyone again for joining us.
Thank you. It was great. Thanks a lot.
And I'll put an end to the meeting. Bye.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everyone.